I was standing beside my daughter when the metal screamed. 1 second there was applause, phones raised, smiles frozen. The next, my father lifted a crowbar and brought it down on the hood of her brand new Mustang. No one moved. Not my mother. Not my siblings. Not the relatives who had just been cheering. My daughter didn't cry. She stared at the dent forming, slow and irreversible. I felt heat rush to my face, then nothing at all. Silence swallowed the yard. In that quiet, I understood something had finally broken, and it wasn't just the car anymore. My father did not apologize. He did not explain himself. He stood there holding the crowbar like it was a tool he had every right to use. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else said my daughter's name, soft, as if calling her might fix the moment. My father spoke instead. He said the car was excessive. He said it sent the wrong message. He said my sister had struggled and needed it more. He said all this calmly, as if he were correcting a mistake, not destroying something in front of a crowd. I looked at my mother first. She stared at the ground. That was her answer. She always stared at the ground. I realized then that this wasn't about a car. It never had been. It was about permission. He believed he had it. Permission to decide what people deserved. Permission to reassign effort. Permission to humiliate, publicly, without consequence. And everyone around him, by staying silent, confirmed it. My daughter stood close to me, her shoulder barely touching my arm. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask what we would do. She was already learning the rule I had grown up with. Don't make it worse by reacting. The party dissolved without an announcement. Plates were set down half full. People avoided eye contact. My sister disappeared into the house. My father handed the crowbar to my cousin and said something about cooling off. No one told him to leave. No one asked if my daughter was okay. They asked if the neighbors had heard. They asked if insurance would cover it. Practical questions. Convenient ones. The kind that keep you from naming what actually happened. On the drive home, my daughter stared out the window. Her phone buzzed once. She didn't check it. I wanted to tell her it would be fixed. That it didn't matter. That gifts weren't everything. None of it felt true. I had worked 2 jobs for that car. I had saved quietly so no one could argue about it ahead of time. I had wanted one moment where effort was visible and honored. Instead, it had been corrected. Publicly. Efficiently. That night, my mother called. She said my father had been stressed. She said my sister was sensitive. She said families sometimes miscommunicate. She said we shouldn't let one moment ruin everything. I asked her why no one stopped him. She paused, then said, "You know how he is." That sentence had covered decades. It had covered birthdays, promotions, weddings, funerals. It was the blanket thrown over every sharp edge so no one had to look at the wound. I didn't argue. I thanked her for calling and hung up. My phone lit up again. A message from my sister. She said it was unfair to flaunt money in front of her. She said my daughter was young and would understand later. She said Dad was just trying to keep things balanced. Balanced? The word sat heavy. Balanced always meant redistributed downward. From me. From my daughter. Toward whoever demanded the most. I lay awake that night listening to my daughter move around her room. She didn't cry. She didn't slam doors. She took the cover off her car keys and set them on her desk, carefully, like they still mattered. I understood then that nothing had ended at that party. Something older had simply revealed itself clearly. And clarity, once it arrives, doesn't leave quietly. It waits. When I was younger, I used to believe moments like that were accidents. I told myself my father didn't mean the things he did. That my mother stayed quiet to keep peace. That my sister took more because she needed more. It was easier to believe the story where no one was choosing. But after the Mustang, the timeline rearranged itself in my head. Events I had filed away as isolated suddenly lined up. A pattern doesn't look like a pattern until you stop explaining it away. I was always the flexible one. The reliable one. If plans changed, mine were the first to move. If something needed to be covered, I covered it. I paid for group dinners because I earned a little more. I hosted holidays because my house was central. When my sister needed help with rent, my father called me, not because I offered, but because it was assumed. He framed it as temporary. It never was. Temporary things have an end. This didn't. At family gatherings, my accomplishments were summarized quickly, then redirected. "She's doing fine," my father would say, before turning to ask my sister how she was coping. Coping with what was never clear. She always seemed to be in transition. Between jobs. Between relationships. Between versions of herself that required patience and funding. My daughter noticed before I did. Once, after a birthday dinner where her cousin received a more expensive gift, she asked me if we were supposed to need less. I laughed it off. I shouldn't have. When my daughter was born, my father said children change priorities. He meant mine. He stopped asking about my work. He started commenting on my availability. When I couldn't attend a last-minute gathering because of childcare, he said I was pulling away from the family. When my sister missed events, it was framed as self-care. The language mattered. It always did. One of us was difficult. The other was delicate. The Mustang was supposed to be different because it was visible. Because effort had a shape. I thought if people could see it, they would respect it. Instead, visibility made it a target. My father didn't just damage a car. He corrected a narrative. He reminded everyone that nothing I provided was beyond revision. That even my daughter's joy could be reassigned if it disrupted the hierarchy. In the days that followed, relatives reached out selectively. Not to ask how my daughter was doing. To ask what I planned to do next. The tone was careful. As if my reaction, not his action, would determine whether the situation became uncomfortable. I realized then how often I had been managing other people's comfort at my own expense. Silence had been my contribution. Compliance my currency. My daughter stopped mentioning the car. She walked to school even though the Mustang sat in the driveway, damaged and unused. When I asked why, she said she didn't want to answer questions. That sentence landed harder than anything my father had said. She was already learning how to shrink moments so other people didn't feel awkward. The clearest sign of the pattern came from my sister again. She sent a long message explaining how hurt she was. Not by the destruction, but by my lack of understanding. She wrote that Dad had always known best. That I had turned a celebration into a statement. That my daughter would benefit from learning humility early. I read it twice. Nowhere did she mention the crowbar. Nowhere did she name what had happened. Erasure was part of the system too. That night, my daughter asked me if we were still going to family dinners. I told her yes, because I wasn't ready yet. But inside, something had shifted. I was no longer confused. I was tired in a different way. The kind that comes when you finally stop hoping the pattern will break on its own. The boundary was crossed on a Tuesday morning, quietly, the way serious things often are. I was at work when my phone rang. It was the insurance adjuster. His voice was polite, practiced. He said there was an issue with the claim. He asked if I had given permission for my father to move or handle the vehicle before the damage occurred. I said no. He paused, then said my father had stated otherwise. He had told them he was acting on my behalf. That the incident was a misunderstanding. That the damage was part of a family dispute and should not involve authorities. I hung up and sat there for a long time without moving. This wasn't about saving face anymore. This was about rewriting reality. He hadn't just damaged property. He had attempted to control the aftermath. To speak for me. To erase my agency in an official record. It was the same behavior, just escalated. Private humiliation had become administrative manipulation. When I confronted him later that evening, my voice stayed even. I asked why he had spoken to the insurance company. He looked surprised, then annoyed. He said he was helping. He said I was overreacting. He said involving outsiders would make the family look bad. My mother sat beside him, hands folded. She didn't look at me. My sister watched closely, waiting to see who would win. I told him calmly that he had no right to represent me. That the car was in my name. That the damage was intentional. For the first time, I didn't soften my words. I didn't cushion them with understanding. He stood up. He said I was accusing him. He said after everything he had done for me, this was how I repaid him. He said I was choosing a machine over my own father. Something settled in me then. Not anger. Finality. I realized I had been negotiating for years, hoping to be granted basic respect. But respect isn't something you earn from someone who benefits from denying it. My daughter stood in the doorway, unseen by him. I caught her eye. She wasn't crying. She was watching. That mattered more than anything else. I told my father I would not be dropping the report. I told him any further communication with insurers, lawyers, or repair shops would go through me. He laughed once and said I wouldn't follow through. He said I never did. That was the moment. Not the crowbar. Not the silence at the party. This. The certainty in his voice that I would fold. I didn't argue. I picked up my bag and left. My mother didn't stop me. My sister didn't speak. On the drive home, my hands shook on the steering wheel. Not from fear. From unfamiliarity. I had stepped out of a role I had played my entire life. The reliable one. The buffer. The one who absorbed impact so others could stay comfortable. That night, I filed the police report properly. I documented everything. Dates. Messages. Names. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't editorialize. I stated facts. It felt strange, reducing years of behavior into neutral language. But there was power in it. Paper doesn't negotiate. Records don't accept excuses. My daughter watched me quietly as I worked. When I finished, she asked if this meant we wouldn't see them for a while. I told her yes. She nodded, relieved. That reaction told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't lost anything by stepping back. She had been carrying the weight too. The next day, my phone filled with messages. Relatives urging me to reconsider. Warnings about consequences. Comments about forgiveness. I didn't respond. For the first time, I wasn't trying to be understood. I was done explaining. Whatever came next would come without my participation. And that was the boundary. The consequences did not arrive loudly. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final argument where everything was said at once. Things simply began to move without me. The insurance company proceeded with the claim using the police report. The repair estimate was approved. The body shop scheduled the work. Each step was methodical, impersonal. My father called twice. I didn't answer. He left one voicemail saying we needed to talk like adults. I deleted it without listening again. A week later, my grandmother called. She asked how my daughter was. Not about the car. About her. That alone told me she had been watching longer than I realized. We met for coffee 2 days later. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't express outrage. She said she had seen what happened at the party. She said she had heard how it was handled afterward. Then she said she had made a decision. Not impulsive. Overdue. She explained, carefully, that the house my parents lived in was legally hers. It always had been. She had allowed them to stay out of habit, not obligation. She had paid the taxes, the upkeep, the repairs. She said she thought stability would soften my father. Instead, it had sharpened him. She told me she was placing the property into a living trust. She told me the terms were simple. Either he left, or they both did. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired, and oddly calm. This wasn't revenge. It was correction. The paperwork moved quickly after that. Notices were delivered. Deadlines were set. My father responded the only way he knew how. He called relatives. He framed himself as betrayed. He accused me of manipulation. But his words worked differently now. They no longer had a surface to land on. People asked questions. Some quietly stepped back. My sister called once, angry and confused. She asked how things had gotten so out of hand. I didn't answer that either. There was no benefit in explaining a system to someone who had thrived inside it. A month later, the house was vacated. My parents moved into a short-term rental. The family gatherings stopped. The group chats went quiet. It felt less like loss and more like decompression. The Mustang came back from the shop on a Thursday afternoon. The hood was smooth again. The paint flawless. My daughter ran her hand over it once, then smiled. Not a big smile. A contained one. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. She drove it to school the next day without hesitation. When she came home, she said it felt different now. Like it was actually hers. Life narrowed in a good way. Fewer messages. Fewer obligations. More space. I started noticing how quiet evenings could be. How light mornings felt without bracing for conflict. My daughter laughed more easily. She invited friends over without asking if it was okay. She stopped rehearsing explanations. Months later, my father sent one final message. He said he didn't recognize me anymore. I read it once. He was right. I didn't reply. Recognition had always been his tool. Withholding it was my freedom. I still see my grandmother regularly. We don't talk about what happened. We talk about ordinary things. The weather. Books. Plans. That is how this cycle ended. Not with a confrontation, but with a shift. A quiet realignment where control lost its audience and consequence did the rest.